Good morning, everyone. What a beautiful fall day we have here. And I was thinking as I was driving in, what better thing to do than to come to a HASP class, right? And start the day out right. So I have several announcements to make here that Ian has given me. So I'm going to be reading all this to you. First of all, my name is Jan Fike, and I'm a member of the Fine Arts Committee. Our team is happy to bring you today's session. Please take out your cell phones right now and ensure they are silenced so as not to distract from today's presentation. Thank you. Also, welcome to the crowd joining via Zoom in the HASP virtual classroom. If you have any questions or comments to pose at the appropriate times, we kindly ask you to wait for the microphone so all the participants can hear you. And I'm going to be sitting in the back there, so just raise your hand and I'll be able to see whenever you raise your hand, and I'll come with a microphone to you. One way you can give back to HASP is to share your personal and professional experience as the presenter of a course. Anybody interested? Do you have a great idea but need some help building your course? Has uncertainty about your visual aid kept you from the front of the classroom? Join HASP members Dave Couch and Susan Couch as they introduce Microsoft PowerPoint and provide you tips and tricks for an engaging presentation. This event will be hosted next Monday, October 23 at 9:30 in room 237 of the Martha Miller Center on the campus of Hope. Learn how to insert images and text, create title and context slides, use templates for easy slide design. Please see Amy or Ian after class today to sign up for this PowerPointers tips and tricks for your next presentation. And next I want to reintroduce Clay Stauffer to us, who is going to present session 2 of our course. And I mentioned last week that he had been in the publishing business, and now he's in the art business, teaching art and doing art and whatever else. I think that's all I have to say. Okay, I think we're ready for you, Clay.
Thank you, Jan. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, first of all, thank you for coming back. I'm going to try to keep you so interested that you'll definitely want to come back for the third installment, which is about the Hollywood era. And although every era that we've divided it up into 3 eras is interesting, I think the Hollywood era is particularly fun because we're going to focus on a lot of the stars, how the movie industry became consolidated, how we ended up with the studio system that we have, plenty of scandal. Not that that's always good, but it's always interesting. And before we go ahead, a gentleman had asked last week about how many, I think the question was how many European, we know that about 75% or more of American silent films were lost. And so I just wanted to double check on the European, whether that was any difference over there. And I saw a statistic from Deutsche Kinematic, and I believe the figure is 80%. So comparable loss of silent film heritage on both sides of the Atlantic, and I guess around the world maybe. So I just want to encourage if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand right away or let me know. And I got to remember to work through Jan on that. sometimes forget that, but I think a lot of our most interesting discussions and points come up when they're generated from you folks. So just want to encourage you to do that. Okay, well, we ended up last week with kind of in the nick of time with The Great Train Robbery by Edwin S. Porter. It was a real hit film, and we're going to kind of pick up there that anytime you try to divide something into historical eras, you're going to end up making some kind of invidious distinctions, and so our general period is going to be 1908 to 1920, roughly. I mean, the Nickelodeon era is considered to have started in 1905, but we're going to kind of fudge around that. So don't hold me fast to this these dates, but it's sort of a general period of time. The slide here is from Quo Vadis by Enrico Guazzoni, a great Italian director from 1913. And this was, the European feature films are very influential. We'll go into that in a little while. But as you can see, there was a cast of thousands, or certainly hundreds, and American audiences grew to really love these spectacle films. So to review, I wanted to point out what Neil Harris, a film scholar, called an operational aesthetic. And if you remember in The Great Train Robbery, Porter meticulously showed each step of this robbery, from the explosion, when they stole the money, when they stopped the train, they disconnected the rest of the train from the engine, pulled all the passengers off the train, so forth and so on. It was sort of a template for a lot of heist films since then, when you think about it. And so this genre really got started very early. In fact, there were some forerunners of this film, but this was certainly a huge success for Porter. But as Musser says here, there was some temporal repetition. The filmmaker still didn't have the kind of seamless portrayal of time, of temporality, and that we have grown used to. Although it's certainly improved from, I say improved, it's more to our, it's more like what we're used to than certainly in Life of an American Fireman version 1 that we saw, in which some people have likened it to some of the great epic poems. You tell about an action, and then you go back and you tell about it again from a different point of view, which is certainly a time-tested way of doing it. But for film, filmmakers had to come up with a way of narrating events that was more easily comprehensible to their audiences, because their audiences came from all different backgrounds and may or may not have known the story. So Porter did use some close-ups, excuse me, and he did use some camera movement. There were some panning shots and so forth, and a famous panning and tilting shot on the moving train. And so film history moved forward quite a bit with this film. So let's review some of the hallmarks of early cinema. As I mentioned, the subject matter often was known to early spectators. That was one way you could get around the sort of arduous task of, how do I narrate this? How do I, if you pick something people knew, then you made life a lot easier for you. I probably haven't talked enough about intertitles and sound effects and some of the things that presenters, film exhibitors did to help audiences keep up with the narrative. They often would have lecturers talking through what was going on, and we saw in the Méliès film that often a narrator would say, okay, here are the scientists, here they're getting into the capsule, blah, blah, blah. Sound effects were important, and some presenters actually added actors behind the screen to give an illusion of, to enhance the illusion that things were, that this was a real spectacle that you were seeing. And of course, piano, organ, other sound effects. And then starting about 1903, intertitles, which we often kind of routinely associate with silent film. But despite all these efforts, spectators were often left confused because the story was either unfamiliar or not told in a way that was comprehensible. The mode of representation was presentational and frontal. That is, only as we move into this so-called era of narrative integration do filmmakers start using more shots from more angles, so-called scene dissection or scene analysis. And of course, nowadays we're used to the director showing us the optimal point of view at any given time, where shots are often extremely short. And this was something that had to grow, that had to be developed. Meanwhile, though, this presentational style, rooted as it was in, you know, traditional visual arts, we do get very interesting compositions. And so anytime you see that frame, a good filmmaker like Porter or certainly Griffith will compose within that scene. And so that was something that, of course, they understood, because there was a whole Beaux-Arts history that they could draw on. Different levels of representing reality. You can see in some early films, it's pretty clear that the sets were painted, that the furniture was, you know, painted, that things were, sets were borrowed from the stage kind of approach, which is certainly fair enough, but already viewers want a level of illusion that theater doesn't really offer. And this is sort of one of the differences between the stage and the screen. And as we discussed early on, spectators could not assume that a story would unfold in chronological order. So they were kind of left at sea sometimes. One of the really important things that happened, you know, I'm going to move forward temporarily to this slide, is that early on, you had producers of films, Edison, and in West Orange, New Jersey, and the Black Maria studio. You had the audiences in the Nickelodeon or wherever they might have been. And then in the middle, you had exhibitors and distributors. And over time, you still had producers, you still had spectators, but the distribution and the presentation of the film it's sort of merged over time. And ultimately, kind of looking forward to the next class, you'll see that the producers and presenters, in many cases, for instance, Adolph Zukor and some of the other early Hollywood moguls, would buy theaters, lots and lots of theaters, so that they would vertically integrate and owned the actual sites of a lot of the presentations. Yes. Oh, yeah, sure.
Related to what you just stated, I noticed in the early posters, like the Great Train Robbery, that it was really presented from a marketing standpoint as Edison Films.
Right.
So, you know, you look back at that era, the early era of motion pictures, it's promoting the title and the producer or whatever,
Right.
Edison Films, as a brand, as opposed to the latest Tom Hanks film. You don't see the actor, or if it's in there, it's lost in the small type. So when did it emerge that the draw was more who is the actors or whatever, as opposed to, you know, Edison Films? That means it must be the latest technology. So that's why we're driven to a Edison film. So when do they start branding things or marketing things based on either content or actors? When did that transition start to happen?
Right. Do I need to repeat the question, or everybody? Okay. I'm so glad you asked that, because I might have glossed over it and then not given it. That's a really important point. And early on, well, Edison was one thing. Edison was he was highly litigious, and I can't, to go through all the court cases and his, I'm going to call them machinations. Maybe that's unfair to him. He just wanted his business to thrive and keep competitors out. But a lot of this was played out in the courts, and it really affected production. And I'll go into that a little bit later. So yes, early on, films would have been marketed to exhibitors who would have had early on to buy the film. You know, Edison would have run advertisements in newspapers saying, you know, this, I should have maybe put one in a slide. Buy this film, here's how long it is, here's what it shows, it's the highest quality, your audiences will love it. Excuse me. And Vitagraph and Biograph and other film producers would have done the same thing. As for when did that change, early on and up, sort of gradual, and that's why we'll talk about Mary Pickford this week. It wasn't until 13, 14, 15, that time, for instance, that Mary Pickford started negotiating her own salary and position within the company, that with Zukor, for instance. Before then, producers of films did not want to publicize their actors and actresses, even by name. For instance, Clara Bow, famous early actress, was known, I think, as the Biograph girl, and that's how she was referred to. People would remember her face, and they would want to know who she was. And then the trade press and then fan magazines started clamoring for information about who was this figure who was in this film. But the producers wanted to kind of tamp that down, because they knew that as, for instance, Clara Bow or Mary Pickford got to become household names, they would come back and say, you know, I'm vital to your success, I think I should be paid more. And that they didn't want that. Ultimately, that changed. Some of the renegade independent producers decided they would do an end run around the Edison Trust, which I'll go into in a minute, and started publicizing. And so you're exactly right. I think your instincts were right on. It early on, they wanted to keep things anonymous, but as time went on, people decided, oh, I want to know who this young woman is. And great question. I'm so glad you brought that up. Yeah, so a gradual shift in editorial responsibility, that is, the early programs, 1903, 1904, 5, up 6, as time, that period, you would have short films. You might have a vaudeville act or a juggler or who knows what going on, or a short stage play. Then you'd show some more films. And that was a typical evening's entertainment. As Nickelodeon's got established, they would just run 16 hours a day or whatever it was, showing films with maybe 10 minutes in between. By 1906, demand for new films was far greater than supply, partly because of the Edison court cases and uncertainty. American film producers were a little stymied. You know, do I invest in new camera and equipment when I'm not really sure if these what the legal status is of my production? Oftentimes they would duplicate European films like the Méliès films that we saw, or Pathé films, and show those, even though that was not really permitted. You probably saw in the actually in both films that we showed, The Life of an American Fireman and The Great Train Robbery, that sort of discreetly in various scenes, you would see either when Life of an American Fireman, the picture on the wall near the door and the window had Edison's signature, and that was sort of his trademark. And that was a reminder that, look, don't pirate this because this is an Edison product. In contrast to what we'll see later on next week, production of films before 1907 tended to be small teams. I didn't even use the word director, really. It was just a small team of usually guys, and they had to put together lots and lots of films because the demand was insatiable. By the fall of 1907, there was an economic recession, not a super long one, but long enough that, and significant enough that it changed the economic environment. And more importantly, the formation of the Motion Picture Patents Company in 08 and 09 really changed how things happened. And we'll come back to that shortly. As we talked about, most of the films were shorts. There was a rental film exchange system that developed. Entrepreneurs decided, well, wait, why do I need to buy a film when I could, or why do I need to buy each? I could buy them and rent them out to other exhibitors. And other exhibitors said, yeah, that would make sense. Sort of like we used to go to the movie place and rent a VHS cartridge, right? Only a little bit different way, but very important that one reel, about 12 to 15 minutes, became a standard unit. And so films were known as one-reelers, or there were two-reelers, and then you had the feature films, which were multiple reels and were more demanding to show, and we'll go into that as well. By 1907, Nickelodeons were drawing 1 million patrons a day across this country, which is kind of amazing when you think of the 26 million a week. And then between 1904 and 1908, the number of Nickelodeons nationwide grew to between 8,000 and 10,000. There were 15 in Grand Rapids alone. Here's a shot of South State Street in Chicago between Harrison and Polk. And just down on the right there, you can see the Chicago Theater, an early Nickelodeon. As I did refer to in the title, silent films were anything but silent normally. On the right there, you can see a piano score that was keyed to the particular film. And so total time, minute 30. So that the pianist kind of had a sense of how fast am I supposed to play this? How much time do I have? And of course, the scores to these films were sold, and if you really liked a particular one, you could go buy it as sheet music. So let's kind of look at the Nickelodeon era itself. We talked about actualities and fire engines and people leaving factories and so forth. That was fine, and people enjoyed the spectacle, but turns out what people really wanted were stories. So the popularity of story films surged. There were still a lot of actualities type films in the pipeline and being circulated, but gradually the production of story films exceeded the production of those films, and they just more or less supplanted over time the actualities type spectacle films. Projector sales boomed. As we'll see next week, the film business did not have a good reputation among I'm going to say the bourgeoisie, the middle class and the upper classes. This was something that sort of had a faint odor about it that was off. It was not a respectable business. Early on, you wouldn't say, oh, we could make some jokes about it. But despite that, there was a lot of money to be made. As you can see, there was a huge amount of growth. And if you could get a projector, get a storefront, get some films, advertise, you could show these films most of the day, and you could make some money. And for people who were interested and hungry and eager to make their way in American society, this was a good way to do it. As people could see, this was growing. Partially because, as I mentioned, the Edison legal battles, foreign producers kind of made up the difference in what American producers were not able to supply. And Pate Frères, I got the accent wrong on Frères, but anyway, was a dominant producer, French producer of films. As I say there, 1907 alone, 1/3 of films released in the United States were American made, and then Pathé alone accounted for more than a third. Meanwhile, Edison and other American producers duped illegally Pathé films. Excuse me. Some producers were able to increase their production. Vitagraph and Lubin, Edison, Biograph, Selig, for various reasons, kind of stalled out. Edison's patent infringement lawsuits created uncertainty among producers, which deterred new investment in plant and equipment. It's the legal. I don't think it would make a very interesting presentation to go into all the legal battles. I think what we need to know is that it was uncertain. Things were being played out, and people just didn't feel comfortable making investments if you weren't sure about the outcome. And as I mentioned, 26 people a week, 26 million people a week went to the movies. One of the things I want to kind of go back to as a theme is that this period saw women emerge as a really potent economic force. Not, excuse me. Sorry about that. They were making a lot of the consumer buying decisions in their households, and never mind, throw it down. Breaking your drums. And more importantly, for our purposes, women comprised 40% of working class movie audiences in 1910. And a lot of film scholars, I mean, it's debatable. Film scholars talk a lot about this. Oh, thank you. I'm dying. I don't know why. Talk about how big a role women played. Miriam Hansen, a really gifted film scholar, she unfortunately passed away a few years ago, talks a lot about women and the role they played in very early films, even some of the early fights that were filmed and then shown, presented across the USA. And she points out, and this is a contention she makes, that women in particular would go to these movie presentations of like the Corbett Fitzsimmons fight, which you wouldn't necessarily think that would happen, but it did. And it was sort of a forerunner of women audiences infatuation with Rudolph Valentino, for instance, very important. And we'll talk about him in next week's presentation. But women were very important to this new medium of communication and expression. And also kids, I say kids, young people, boys and girls. And this was controversial. This is especially since a lot of these folks were children of immigrants, which kind of had a tough role. It was kind of a tough time, I guess, as it always is for new immigrants. How do you fit into a new country, and how do you make your way? And I want to I don't consider it a digression, but I just want to talk a little bit about this issue. I'm going to quote from Strangers in the Land, Patterns of American Nativism, well-regarded work on immigration in this country. All through the progressive era, the human tide rolled in from crowded Europe. From a low point in 1897, the current ascended to its zenith in 1907, and then fluctuated at a level above 650,000 a year until the outbreak of the First World War. So huge immigration made our country stronger. I think we would all agree with that. Immigrants tended to stay in urban areas for various reasons. I mean, that's not a hard and fast rule. We can think of lots of examples of enclaves out in the Middle West, but with this wave in particular, there was partially because they came from the Southern and Eastern Europe. Previous waves of immigration had come from Northwest Europe primarily, and there was a reaction to this. Religious reactions. Most of the immigrants at this era were Catholics and Jews, which Protestants maybe didn't mix that well with. States began to outlaw unnaturalized foreigners from various white-collar jobs. In New York, they were not permitted to be attorneys. In Michigan, we actually wouldn't let them be barbers, interestingly. I didn't follow that up to find if that's still on the books. Private detectives, CPAs. Anyway, you can see immigration was, as it is now, extremely controversial. And when you combine the development of modern film into the mix, it made for a volatile mixture. In 1910, an estimated 75% of New York City's population consisted of immigrants and first-generation Americans. So it was a heady time, and I think it's something that we need to keep in mind. All right. So the reaction to this, particularly in Chicago and New York, was that the local political officials decided to crack down on these movie houses. And as I say, it just had an unsavory air about it to some folks who were more establishment, as we say nowadays, and came from a different class of a household. Chicago Tribune launched a campaign in 1907, ostensibly to protect children from these movies. They weren't really sure what these movies were telling young people and so forth. And in response, a police censorship board was formed. It's really an interesting thing if you want to look into it. And I think I have something in the bibliography about that. So if anybody's interested, I can make more copies of that. Yeah, so Chicago had a police censorship board with a police censor who later on turned out to be corrupt. He and his friends would watch the films and look out for the best parts, and then it was just kind of a mess. In New York City, Mayor McClellan attempts to close the Nickelodeons. The New York State Board of Censorship first meets in 1909, and that's the forerunner of the National Board of Review, which kept operating for decades after that, a long time. And certain states, Kansas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Maryland, and Virginia, established censorship boards. People were really worried, what was going on in these films, and we're losing control here. And as I won't read this whole thing, but film makers, film producers had different reactions. One was self-censorship. Another approach was to support some of these efforts in order to sort of forestall any hard-handed action. So we talked about immigration and urbanization. A wonderful quote from Charles Musser: "With the advent of the Nickelodeons, moving pictures became a democratic art." So you can see the period we're talking about in this chart on the right, 1910 is right at the end of the peak of that wave. And then in the teens, you started to see restrictions on immigration on a national level, and the conflagration of World War I, which really, for obvious reasons, slowed everything down. But let's shift back to, pretty soon we're gonna watch a film, important film. Most scholars accept that there was a shift from these so-called primitive modes of narration that we talked about in Life of American Fireman, to more classical modes. That is what we'll see with Griffith in particular, and then onward, and then really being developed in the 20s as the so-called classical Hollywood narrative approach. I'm going to read something from Miriam Hansen, and she was born in Germany, just a wonderful, highly intelligent woman, but German was her first language, so her sentence structure, it's beautiful, but it's complex. She's talking about the shift in modes of narration. This shift involved a transition from narratives highly dependent on extra diegetic sources. That is, we know about Goldilocks and the Three Bears. We know about what's another one? Peter and the Wolf. We know about these fairy tales, or whatever they might happen to be. Audience foreknowledge of the story, mediation through a lecture, or sound effects. All these things that we've been talking about that producers were using to help people navigate through their productions, to narratives that were self-explanatory and self-contained. And this was maybe one of the reasons really to study silent film, because there we are seeing this medium become self-conscious, as it were, and realize its potential and what it needed to do for audiences and create the conventions that made that possible. So she talks about the resources of cinematic discourse, framing, the composition. We've talked about that. And early films had a pretty good sense of that. I mean, classical Beaux-Arts compositional principles were, everybody sort of knew about that. Editing, however, the manner in which shots are arranged was very important because early on, producers were still thinking of films in terms of scenes, as if it were a play. In fact, they called them photoplays. That was a common term for motion pictures. So the manner in which shots are arranged became more and more and more important. And then what we call the very sophisticated sounding French phrase, mise en scène, everything, the positioning of the actors, the set, the locale, the props filling that set or locale, the lighting of the set, and the composition of the shot. It's everything that the filmmaker has at his or her disposal was mise en scène. And they learned that between editing and the mise en scène, we can do everything we need to do, and there's a unlimited possibility here. So the objective was clarity, as it is in any good work of art. Well, I guess that's debated, but I'm going to stand with that. Compositional unity and motivation, so we could understand why the characters are doing what they're doing. So I'm going to go ahead a little bit because I don't want this to become boring. We're going to talk about Griffith, and we'll go back to the Motion Picture Patent Association. I think I've pondered this, how best to refer to him. I would just say an enigmatic figure. We're not going to talk really directly about his two most famous films, just because we could do a 3-part course on or more on those. But he did many, many more films, and more than 451 and 2 reel films for Biograph alone. So his output was tremendous. He was born in 1875 in rural Kentucky near the Indiana border. And his family was adversely affected by the Civil War Reconstruction, the outcome of the Civil War. His father was a Confederate Army colonel, and Griffith just absorbed that point of view, I guess we could say, when he was a child, and grew up naively absorbing the romanticism and mythologies of the Old South. And it would be an interesting discussion. We could debate some of these things, but I think in 2023, we can say that that's what it was: romanticism and mythological understanding of the Old South. You can read as well as I can. His first goal was the stage. That really didn't work out. He did write a play, sold it for $1,000 then, which is pretty impressive. The play was panned and closed soon after. I should note that writing scenarios, which is what they called screenplays back then, was widely seen as a really kind of viable career path. You would see ads in the paper for schools to teach you how to write scenarios for photoplays, and for anybody who liked to write and was creative, that was a kind of an interesting choice. So anyway, Porter did that. Griffith did that. He submitted one to Edwin S. Porter. Porter rejected the screenplay, but offered an acting job to Griffith in Rescued from an Eagle's Nest. Not really important what the film was, but Griffith then went to American Mutoscope and Biograph Company, which was started by, you remember Edwin Dixon, Edison's right-hand man? He and some other folks started the Mutoscope and Biograph Company. William Kennedy, Laurie Dixon, and became an assistant there. And one thing led to another. I misspelled melodramatic. Apologize for that. His first film at Biograph was The Adventures of Dolly, and it's still, you can watch it on YouTube. I think if you do a search, you could watch it. And then over the next 5 years, he did more than 450 one and two reelers, as I noted. We're going to watch The Lonely Villa, which is a really important film because of it's a good case study for us as Life of American Fireman was, in terms of how a film producer, director can propel a story and show action occurring in two areas simultaneously, which is kind of a project when you think about it. And that's, again, what this class is about. So as David Cook points out, was probably The Lonely Villa was probably the first dramatic film to employ the device parallel editing as its basic structural principle across three spatial planes. After its debut, the practice of intercutting, as it came to be known, passed rapidly and permanently into the cinema's narrative lexicon. And so Griffith understood this, the role of intercutting so well. So we're going to watch this. And here we go.
From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
It's about 12 minutes, I think.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress.
Well, quite a film, isn't it? For 12 minutes. Any thoughts after you've watched it? Anything you care to share? Anything that you noticed about the film? Yes. I don't know if we need sorry.
I thought it was interesting that the ladies that had Gypsy Queen and the dancer was probably the local prostitutes,
Yeah,
which was a common thing at that time.
yeah, that's an interesting point. And I might add that The Adventures of Dolly, Griffith's first film, included, and it's seen as very bigoted, perhaps racist. The kidnappers are gypsies, and I know that's not a good term to use, but already you can see that although they do help in this case, Griffith is sensitive to these marginalized groups, and sensitive in a way useful in terms of the storyline. Yes.
I was going to go along with that. I can see why women were particularly fascinated with going to these films, because the films were teaching immigrants on fashion, class, how to behave in public, and immigrants had so much prejudice against them.
Mhm.
They were the lower classes.
Mhm.
So the upper classes wanted to stop this filmmaking, as you pointed out. I didn't realize that, but I can see why. It would be like we might look down on gambling or drinking or
Sure.
not good behavior. And then to another point, going back to the censorship.
Mm-hmm.
Later on, there was the Legion of Decency in
Right.
the Catholic Church,
Mhm.
and that went on for about 20 years or
Right.
so.
Yeah. No, that's actually your first point. They're both great points, but I really want to respond to your point about showing in your immigrants in particular how people dress, how other class. This was tremendously important, and Miriam Hansen in particular is one scholar who really develops this, because it was what we can see here is the beginning of a development of a consumer class. We will see that it will really come out next week with Hollywood, and when the stars are out in Hollywood living in their mansions, they were sort of demonstrating how people live well, and doesn't seem to have created a lot of resentment so much as people were just, as you say, interested in it. Right, exactly. Yes. Great points.
You were commenting earlier about the fact that they were, before all of the films, there was the whole Beaux-Arts and the whole looking at art and looking at
Mhm.
how things were set up in a
Mhm.
picture. And the thing that struck me at the very beginning, where we saw the family in that room,
Yeah.
it was like looking initially before the action really started. It was like looking at one of these old paintings
Right.
of a family enjoying their afternoon
Yeah.
in their peace and quiet. But I also noticed that rather than the gun on the mantle, there was the telephone.
Yeah.
And the fact that that ended up becoming a crucial part of the story later on.
Absolutely.
So it was kind of that whole, the gun on the mantle must be used.
Right.
Same thing with the phone.
Great point. This was actually as I note here, a remake of a Pathé film from 3 years earlier called Terrible Angoisse, based on a 1901 Grand Guignol play, Au Téléphone. So you're absolutely spot on. The telephone is a really important element in this. It's new, it's like film, it's a new relatively new technology. Obviously, phones have been around for a couple of decades, but not everybody had a phone. You had to be I think you had to be well off to have a phone. And it's an important, essential element. And to pick up on what you were saying also, when the kind of shiftless guy comes in, one of the robbers, how he is over near the door, leaning against the door, set apart by the desk between the family. I mean, the composition of the shot is very interesting as well. Yes.
Throughout, there's that AB branding, was that that copyright thing that you
Yeah,
spoke to? I mean,
American,
room to room and any
Mutoscope
other
and Biograph, right.
Right.
Right, that was just what you did back then. And I think ostensibly if you tried to duplicate the film, you would duplicate. It's like a watermark is what it is.
Yeah, it's like a product placement.
Yeah,
like you have
exactly.
today.
Reminding people, hey, this is this brand of film. And in fact, people would talk about it and they'd say, yeah, I really love Biograph films. I'm going to go see, there's one, and they might not even know what it was about, but the fact that it was a biograph or an Edison. Yes.
I just wonder where they got the lonely part of it.
Yeah, I think it was to reinforce the idea that it was isolated and there was some vulnerability from being that isolated. Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay.
The lonely villa means something's gonna happen there, right?
Going back to that very first sort of the
Mhm.
tableau of the family,
Mhm.
it also occurred to me that the young girl who's kind of her back was to us,
Mhm.
her dress seemed awfully short for a girl that age.
Hmm.
I'm wondering if maybe that might have been a little bit of that whole censorship thing that here are these legs. Yeah, she's showing an awful lot of leg
Well-
for a girl that age.
It's interesting you
that
point that
time.
out because there's a film, a really well-known silent film called The Gay Shoe Clerk, and it's not a gay in the sense that we use it now, but kind of the lighthearted, adventurous, mischievous shoe clerk. And the film is this shoe clerk who is helping a lady try on some shoes. The ankle was a really important erogenous zone back then, and she shows him a little bit of her ankle with a sock on it. I mean, it's not exactly any, that thrilling. And they end up kissing. And the woman who is accompanying this woman who's trying on shoes starts hitting the shoe clerk with her umbrella and beating him up. So it's a neat film. I think you can watch it on YouTube. The Gay Shoe Clerk is 1902 or 3. I think it's a Porter film, but Edison Porter film. Yeah. So you're absolutely right. Every little detail is important. Nothing, particularly with Griffith. And I'm not a big fan of his in the sense that we won't go there, but the films often are, the details are very important. I hope you all sensed and noticed that when the father got to the hotel or the whatever it was there, that inn, and then talked to his wife on the phone, that the intercuts got shorter, that he would cut to that and it would be pretty short, and then he'd cut back to him, and back to, and then the tempo increased to increase that sense. It's as in a piece of music, for instance, you would increase the tension that way. And I don't know, I loved the guy with the pipe just kind of watching, because he's sort of a stand-in for us, right? And he's listening to what's going on, and then another guy comes up and he's looking at and then also you could kind of get two things done in this movie too, right? I mean, you have a chase film within a film, and the chase film was its own kind of genre. I mean, early on, there would just be entire films of chases. Because when you think about it, a chase has this teleology about it. It's, you know what it's about. It's somebody chasing somebody. I mean, you don't need a lot of explanation. And it's a very compelling thing. Who's going to win, right? I mean, that's sort of built into a chase. So all these things come into play. Well, really good points. This is a 52 shot film, as we see there, which was a lot of shot for a one reel film back in the day. So
From the
I am actually going to move forward and not talk a lot about the MPPC unless we have time to do it, because there's some more film that I want us to watch, and I don't want you listening so much to me as watching film. Around 1912, with the importation of a film called Queen Elizabeth, American audiences were exposed to elaborate feature films. And these were films that were longer. Sorry about the sentence there, which runs off the slide. When I imported this into, I did it in Keynote, imported it into PowerPoint, some weird things happened. Multiple reel films, among other things, made motion pictures respectable for the middle class audience. They were seen as better, higher class. So this was a complete game changer, and it really left the Motion Picture Patents Association flat-footed, because one of the stipulations in the Edison Trust was that you only would distribute, the members of the trust could only distribute one reel films. And so when audiences still clearly started to prefer longer, bigger productions, this left the trust flat-footed, and exhibitors were saying, well, wait a minute, we can make more money off showing a feature. We can charge more. We only have to buy one film, or rent one film, I should say. And so it was the beginning of the end for the MP Patent Association, Motion Picture Patent Association. Here's a bar chart on silent films, feature films by year. Starts in 1912. I don't expect you to necessarily read that. It's kind of small print. 1913 by 1914, we start to see, and we reach a peak in 1917. And I think what happens is production in general starts to drop off, because films are getting longer and producers just can't pump out the short films the way they were. I don't expect you to navigate this chart. It's a little too detailed, but you can see the point of this chart is that early on in filmmaking, so-called moral experimentation films, in which characters are presented with a dilemma and choose an outcome that is conventionally Victorian, those decline over time, and films in which there's moral experimentation, a quandary, a dilemma, and the character chooses a different way of resolving it, increase, indicating a change in societal attitudes. I probably should have developed this a little bit more to make it a little more easy to read, but it became a dominant plot type. And this fits in perfectly with our understanding of modernism, right? As life becomes more complicated, people have a lot more choices. People have a lot more difficulties getting along. It's not life in a little village anymore. It's life in New York City, perhaps, or Chicago, or Pittsburgh. I want to play just a little bit of the Italian 9-reel film. which after Queen Elizabeth this was a huge hit. And I guess it was the forerunner of the Sandals and Sand type films that were popular in the 50s and 60s. Play a little bit of this, and then I do want to play quite a bit of Mary Pickford in Stella Maris, because not only is it a beautiful film, she plays two roles in the film, and it's really, and you can watch that on, if you want to watch the whole thing, on YouTube. So let me just play a little bit of this so you can kind of get a sense of what people were enthralled about. And this is a some of the subtitles are in Portuguese. I'm not really sure. But audiences really were impressed by that, and movie theaters. This was about the time, a little bit after this, that dedicated movie theaters started to be built, and culminating with the movie palaces of the late 20s that seated thousands of people. I think you've probably been, what's the theater in? Is it the Fox in Detroit? If you've ever been there, or you've probably all been in one of the famous movie palaces. They were built for these kinds of films with a dedicated score, and this made the film industry more respectable and more legitimate. Going back to Griffith, and then I'm going to move to Stella Maris. It's not known whether he saw, I mean, he certainly obviously was aware of Queen Elizabeth and Quo Vadis, And so he decided he was going to push his budget at Biograph and make Judith of Bethulia, a 4-reel 61-minute film, then followed by his 1915 12-reel Birth of a Nation. As I say, at some point, somebody here at HAST should teach this or preside over or a discussion of it, because it's possibly the most interesting American film ever made, not necessarily for good reasons. It's just fundamentally racist and responsible for a lot of our troubles as a country. But at any rate, it was very controversial. Griffith was stung by the criticism. He didn't, of course, for such a gifted man, he had very little self-awareness in some respects. Maybe that's expecting too much. He produced Intolerance, a 210-minute film, so he doubles down. And some people think, and you can read as well as I dare, some people think that it was one of the best films ever made. Some people just don't understand anything about it. I'm sort of, I watched part of it. I just, anyway, you can make up your own mind, because you can watch both of these films on the internet if you want to. So, as you saw in Quo Vadis, it was more of a tableau approach. There was a little panning movement there, but overall, in American filmmaking, the tableau approach kept on in Europe. I mean, in fact, even to the present day, through filmmaking, American producers, on the other hand, were going more to this editing approach, in which you're using more and more shots of different types: close shots, middle shots, panning, different camera angles. And of course, you see this in a film like Citizen Kane. You see maybe that to the nth degree with Orson Welles directing. Just amazing. But I want to just go over this, and then we're going to watch a little bit of Stella Maris and kind of, I guess, end on that. It seems like there's never enough time to do all that we want to do, but we're talking about the transition to classical cinema here in this phase. And one of a point was made by one of you that the movies were showing, the pictures were showing people how to dress, how to do this, how to act. So this was the emergence of spectatorship and the spectator, and this can be unpacked in all sorts of different ways. But you think about it, I don't know about you, but maybe the most important element in the movies is that when we go into that theater and the room darkens, we're isolated from our practical world, and the film illusion becomes complete. And this was not something that just was invented overnight, as we saw. It's something that had to be figured out and developed. As Miriam Hansen says, quote, "The segregation of the fictional space-time on the screen from the actual one of the theater, or rather the subordination of the latter under the spell of the former." This is the essence of this transition to the classical Hollywood approach. So then from about 1909 on, exhibitors were to streamline their shows in the interest of totality of effects. And they started cutting back on the vaudeville acts, or the, you know, jugglers or trick dogs or whatever they might have been had in the show, in the interest of the film. We will talk more about some of this stuff. I really want to talk about the 1915 decision, Mutual Film Corp versus Ohio Industrial Commission. This decided the fate of the movies in America, and basically meant that movies were entertainment. And it's one of the reasons we don't have a robust a wide tradition. There have always been documentaries, but of regarding film as a communications medium, the way we look at, say, newspapers or the written word, is because the court decided that they weren't. And it'd be interesting to talk about this. I think what I'll do is next week talk more about Lois Weber, because I wanted to talk about notable women filmmakers. Some of you may have seen Where Are My Children, which I had here and was going to watch. Very interesting film, talks about birth control and abortion, and in ways that perhaps we haven't come as far as we think we have. She was very daring to do this, if quite didactic, but nevertheless, she was revolutionary. Starting next week, so I hope you'll all come back. We're going to talk about the stars, which is always fun, and we'll talk about the Hollywood studio system. Let's watch a little bit of Stella Maris, and we'll end up that way. And next week we'll pick up and talk about the move to Hollywood and how that affected things. A little bit of editing on my part. Sorry about that. Well, I'm sorry, I'm gonna have to cut it off there. There's a lot I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about Oscar Michaud, uh, uh, Black filmmaker, African-American filmmaker from 1920. So what we'll do is we'll pick up. That's the great thing about doing it in three. And I don't know about you, but there's something about Mary Pickford, and especially her playing two different polar opposite characters. So I encourage you. It's just fascinating. And she's so photogenic and telegenic, I guess. If you care to watch the rest of Stella Maris at home, and then we'll pick up and we'll talk about, we've got a lot more to talk about. And we'll, any questions that you might have, bring them next week. So hope you've enjoyed it, and we'll see you next week. Good, good.